Arizona PBS is proud to support Indian Country Today. For 6 decades, we've provided television programs and now digital content. But we go beyond that, sending outreach teams across Arizona, offering workshops in language and literacy, family engagement and community outreach, and supporting tribal communities with early learning and school readiness resources. Join us at azpbs.org.
This is Indian Country Today.
Esquili, yes, thank you for joining us. I'm Patty Thalahungva. Broadband in Indian Country is a high priority. That's the key point Cherokee Principal Chief Chuck Hoskin Jr. made to President Biden on Wednesday. Hoskin was one of 6 elected officials invited to the White House to discuss how the proposed $1 trillion infrastructure bill will impact Native Americans. The meeting was held virtually.
This bill is important for the country, but I want you to know that the bill is important to me because you didn't forget Indian country. This bill overall has more than $11 billion in investment in Indian country. That is historic, potentially transformational investment for tribes across this country. That's very important.
Indian nations
across this country working as sovereigns to sovereigns with the United States.
Hoskin says internet access is important for many reasons. He singled out elders and said they can use it to meet with healthcare providers virtually or help with language revitalization by speaking to youth in their Cherokee language. A new review of military medals could mean an upgrade for some Native veterans. The military is reviewing service crosses awarded to Native veterans to see if those crosses should be upgraded to Medals of Honor. This review covers the Korean, Vietnam, and World War II wars and veterans who received a Distinguished Service Cross, Navy Cross, or Air Force Cross. Military.com reports Natives who served when racial discrimination was more widespread will now receive equal opportunities for their heroism to be recognized. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin says they are studying acts of valor to decide if they deserve the nation's highest award for valor in combat. A crew of Native Hawaiian scientists are heading on a 15-day research expedition to one of the largest marine conservation areas in the world. The group is sailing in a 96-foot triple-masted schooner. They will visit the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument, which is located north of the Hawaiian Islands. These islands have barely been touched by humans. The idea is to research the land to see what environments look like untouched. One of the scientists on the project explains how building relationships is key to the research.
Yes, take care of the resources, make sure that they're healthy. But in working with Native communities, Native Hawaiian communities, we know that it's all about strengthening healthy relationships between our people, our communities, and the Aina, which is our lands and oceans. So it's really exciting to be part of this change to make sure that the goals of our communities are being at the center of resource management today.
The group will be collaborating on 2 separate scientific studies on sea level rise and intertidal fisheries management. In Lima, Peru, the Shipibo people held a ceremony to express thanks for the protection of the COVID-19 vaccine. The Shipibo are an Amazonic Peruvian group that live in Lima. The Peruvian capital saw a very high COVID-19 rate in 2020. Some 500 indigenous families received the Sinopharm vaccine after health workers went to their neighborhood to explain the benefits of the shot. Pilar RC says she's glad she's now vaccinated.
Well, to say the truth, I was very nervous, but I feel that I am protected. In the end, with this illness that is the COVID-19 pandemic, I feel that I can continue living. So, it's all good for me.
The Peruvian government wants to vaccinate 300,000 adult members from the hundreds of Amazon tribes spread across the country. Currently, 18,000 are fully vaccinated. Lebron James is producing a Netflix drama that centers on basketball at a high school in New Mexico. The new film is called Resball, and it's being shot in Chuska, New Mexico. The characters must band together after losing their star player if they want to keep their quest for a state championship alive. It's an all-American underdog story about Navajo kids and their coaches. And joining Lebron on the project is Sydney Freeland, who will direct from a script she co-wrote with Sterling Harjo. Harjo co-created the FX Hulu series Reservation Dogs. And those are the headlines from Indian Country today. I'm Patty Dolahongva. Up next, how to spend the money in the CARES Act and the infrastructure bill. It's not as simple as it sounds.
And later, the remains of an Aleut girl are repatriated from the former Carlisle Indian Industrial School. Joaqlin Estus joins us with that story. An influx in federal funds that are marked for improving infrastructure in rural areas could be a big boon for tribes. There are a lot of connections between good roads, broadband, and affordable housing because they impact the quality of life for our people. Joining us today to talk about this funding and how it can help tribal communities is Dave Castillo. He's the CEO of Native Community Capital. Welcome, Dave.
Morning.
Well, let's start with the big picture. How does this infrastructure bill and the American Rescue Plan, this influx of capital is huge for Indian country. How is it going to impact in a broad sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's massive. And that's really the key question. How will it impact and will it impact? I think before the new administration took over, the first stimulus bill that made funds available to tribes was a little problematic, because it was such a windfall of cash. Tribes just, in many cases, didn't have the capacity to deploy the funds within the regulatory framework that was required, within the time frame that was required. And if you can imagine this, there were some tribes that were actually thinking about sending the money back to Washington, which is absolutely ridiculous. We need every penny of it. And to think that we can have access to the resources and then send it back was really troubling. So the Biden administration, luckily, when they came into office, they extended that time frame to give tribes more time to spend those dollars. But we're at that place again with the new stimulus funds and presumably the infrastructure dollars as well. The trick is going to be to deploy those funds efficiently. And a lot of folks who work in this area know the term shovel ready. Do you have shovel-ready projects? And can you get the funds moved into those projects quickly and efficiently? And that's something that tribes are going to struggle with. And so we need to be planning right now and really putting our best foot forward so that Indian country gets every dollar they're owed and gets it deployed for the projects needed. And in terms of impact, it could be massive. We're talking about roads, bridges, wet and dry utilities, housing, broadband, everything that is lacking in Indian country.
One thing that I know you work on this every day, but one key thing is how do you keep those dollars in a community so that they're not just a one-time spend, but they're creating jobs, they're creating opportunities?
Yeah, that's a great point. And we worked fairly closely with the Indian Affairs Department in New Mexico. And they routinely put out between $10 and $16 million for critical infrastructure in Pueblo and tribal communities in New Mexico. And one of the troubling facts there is that even though the tribes got access to the buildings and the infrastructure that those dollars provided for, only 3% of those dollars stayed within tribal communities, meaning that the contractors, the general contractors and other specialists that came in were mostly non-native. And one of the things that IAD at the time was very concerned about was, why can't we get our tribal members who are tradespeople, whether plumbers, electricians, drywallers, et cetera, to be part of this process so they can also benefit from these dollars and keep those dollars within the tribal community. So that's something we're going to be faced with again here with these new stimulus funds. and to try to keep it revolving. So if there are any contractors out there, native contractors, if you've got an idea for a business that can be part of getting these funds deployed and used on tribal lands, now might be the time to get that business plan together and get registered. And if you've got priority preference with your tribe for contracting, get on that list.
Well, that's a key point. You know, it's from this particular pandemic, it seems that there are two real distinct advantages that an Indian business would have. And one would be the high vaccination rates, where people are going in to the workforce at a much higher rate than the competition. And the second is our youth. I mean, we're a very young population, so both of those play into this time as an opportunity, would they not?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the trade schools that are out there, the unions, shops that are out there, at least in my history through working with the Center for Construction in Indian Country at ASU, there have been, I think, good efforts put out by the industry to come together with tribes to provide those opportunities, either to joint venture or to provide training opportunities and making sure that tribal members are able to take part in this. And you're right, in terms of the vaccination rate, a lot of the pueblos in New Mexico have locked down, and some of the projects have gotten put on hold because those contractors aren't vaccinated or they can't verify that. And so it's very important that in this COVID age, we're looking after that issue, and that tribal members and tribal contractors can come forward and fill the gaps wherever they might be.
One of the challenges with business in tribal communities is balancing between the governance side and the entrepreneurial side. How do you see that as a factor in this spending round?
Well, at the end of the day, it is within the tribal government's purview to regulate activities on tribal lands and to make decisions on expenditure of funds. So that is a critical role that tribal governments play, and it's something I think that we honor and value. But in terms of the business decisions that need to get made, you're right. There is often a rift there in terms of, I think it really comes down to the fact that tribal communities are small. We have kind of a limited pool of individuals or entities that are managing these issues. And when we need tribal leaders to focus on a critical issue that, let's say, I might think is critical, right? One of the things we used to say about tribal leaders is that in the morning, they're dealing with water rights issues. In the afternoon, they're dealing with Indian child welfare issues. And in the evening, they might be dealing with some kind of right-of-way or other intergovernmental agreement. And these are all very specific issues that take specialized knowledge. And to ask tribal leaders to understand those completely and be able to act on them is a little unfair. And unlike members of Congress who have whole staff of people and lobbyists and other industry experts providing them information, tribal leaders are a lot of times doing this on their own. So that's part of it. And I think the message to tribal leadership is, get your trusted advisors together and let's focus. We've got a limited amount of time to get these funds deployed. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity, and we all need to roll up our sleeves and maybe put the politics aside and see what this can do and bring for the generations that come. We miss the boat a lot. I've seen it over my career. It's heartbreaking to know that resources are there and not used where they could be used. So now is the time. Now is the time.
One of the provisions that I think is really critical, and this is something, again, that you do every day, is how do you make sure that tribal governments and that citizens are aware of all the opportunities and the programs they might tap into?
Right. So I think it's going to differ from tribe to tribe, right? If there's a tribe that has, let's say, Navajo Nation that is highly rural and dispersed across a large geography, if the tribal leadership there knows that water issues are significant, then you need to tap into the efforts that have some momentum and really, really grow those. I think for other communities, and we saw this when I used to work on policy issues with tribal leadership, all the tribal leaders didn't know everything, but you could typically look across the room and you'd know that, let's say, President X from certain tribe was really kind of an expert in IHS issues. And so we would lean on that individual to help inform the rest of the tribal leadership and tribes around issues like ambulatory clinics and other critical infrastructure related to IHS services. We had another tribe whose police chief was very prominent in the Indian Country Intelligence Network, so we could lean on him. So again, it really depends on where your capacity is. Some tribes have really moved out front in the agriculture industry, and so have special knowledge there. I think now's not the time to kind of try to dream up new and interesting ideas. Let's kind of buckle down on what we know and get those resources used where we have them. And if you don't have them, like let's say housing and critical infrastructure related to housing, we have national organizations like the National American Indian Housing Council here in Arizona, ASU. We've got the Center for Construction in Indian Country. Of course, we've got Native American Finance. We've got tons of national intermediate organizations, intertribal organizations that really have resources that can be brought to bear to focus on whatever a tribe may need to focus on.
With Washington spending so much on these projects, it kind of raises the question about debt. Should debt be part of this too, and tribes be rethinking how they use debt effectively?
Okay, so a little bit of a biased opinion on my part, right? Because we're a lender. But I would say absolutely, because there's never going to be enough money, right? I mean, if you think about just the cost of infrastructure on tribal lands that, we're not talking about developed cities and towns that have infrastructure that's been there for decades and decades. A lot of times we're talking about raw land. And so we need to build that infrastructure. And depending on how big your tribe is going to say a lot for how much the stimulus money you have. And that may not cover the bill. Infrastructure, the wet and dry utilities and roads are usually talked about $1 million a mile. So if your tribe got 30 million and the only thing you may be able to do is build the roads and infrastructure. And then what about the actual buildings? So leverage is key. And I would encourage tribes to consider opportunities to leverage these dollars, use it as seed capital to bring in other sources.
We have less than a minute left, and I just want to ask you what excites you most about this opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, it's the opportunity. I think I used to be the guy that would bang my fist on the table and tell the private sector and public sector and nonprofit intermediaries they need to do more. And when are you going to move the money? When are we going to make sure that tribes have equal access to capital? And then all of a sudden, it's been a little bit of a shock to my system, but now the funds are flowing. So that's exciting. I mean, it's kind of like after World War II, where Europe got its Marshall Plan. This is kind of like Indian Country's Marshall Plan, and we need to be able to jump on the opportunity.
Dave Castillo, thank you so much.
Thank you.
When we come back, we'll hear about the latest about the Yukon fisheries in Alaska and the repatriation of one Aleut girl. The tragedy of boarding schools has been in the news lately. The remains of 215 children were discovered in a mass grave at a Canadian school in Kamloops, British Columbia. That's put the spotlight on the boarding school era, both in this country and Canada. That era had got underway in the United States in the 1800s. Joaqlin Estus, our national correspondent based in Alaska, joins us now to tell us more about the return of an Aleut girl's remains to Alaska. Welcome, Jacqueline.
Thank you. Good to be here. So Sophia Titoff was an orphan around the turn, just in the early 1900s. And she lived in St. Paul, which is one of the Pribilof Islands. People sometimes have heard of St. Paul from the television show Deadliest Catch. It's a safe port out there in the Bering Sea. So Sophia Titoff was sent to an orphanage And then she was sent 4,000 miles to, she took a boat and then a train across the country to Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. And a few years later, she died and she was buried there. So Carlisle was the first Indian boarding school in the country, and it was a model for hundreds of other schools. It was founded and run by Colonel Richard Pratt, who's best remembered for coming up with the phrase, "Kill the Indian to save the man." He had fought in the Civil War, then in Indian Wars, he ran a prison, and those were experiences that he brought with him to Carlisle. So he ran the Indian school like a military operation, very regimented, and students were sent out to board with families as free labor. Sophia Titoff was sent to live with families in New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, and that was just in 4 or 5 years. She contracted tuberculosis and died in 1906 at the age of 17. So now the Army runs a war college on the grounds of Carlisle, and they've been returning the remains of children that were buried there. So recently, last month, they sent remains of 9 children to the Rosebud Sioux Reservation and 1 back up here to Alaska. So Sophia's great niece and her son accompanied her remains back to St. Paul. And St. Paul is a small town. It's only 400 people. And about 100 of them turned out, welcomed Sophia's remains at the airport. They had a car parade, and then they went to the Russian Orthodox Church where the priest held a full mass for her, and she was buried at the St. Paul Cemetery. So, as you know, you mentioned what's going on, what was discovered at Kamloops, British Columbia. The United States hasn't looked into its boarding school era as closely as Canada has, but Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland, who's Laguna Pueblo, has launched an initiative to look into the history of U.S. boarding schools. And so I think we'll find out a lot more as that comes to be. So, and by the way, boarding schools in Alaska didn't close until the mid-1970s, and only after a lawsuit from students and parents over discrimination. And there were 120 villages in Alaska that didn't have high schools. And so the state, after the lawsuit, the state had a bunch of money from oil. And so we had just a building frenzy of schools in rural Alaska.
St. Paul is interesting. What was the community's reaction to the returns of those remains?
I think that, well, people talked about it as it was very healing, and it brought attention, I think. Now, so the person I talked with said that in her family, her siblings actually were eager to go to boarding school. St. Paul has a very unusual history. It was, the Pribilof Islands were uninhabited until the Russians enslaved Aleuts from the Aleutian Islands and took them there to harvest fur seals. And they kept them under their thumb. And then the United States took over and kept very tight control of the Aleuts on the Pribilof Islands. They had to ask permission they couldn't leave the island. They lived in government housing. They were fed government rations. Agents decided all of that. They even had to ask permission to get married, and agents would tell them who they could marry, and they couldn't leave the island. And this lasted in one form or another until the fur seal harvest was dropped. It was run by the U.S. Department of Commerce under a treaty with Japan and Russia. And because the number of fur seals was going down so dramatically, they finally stopped the harvest. So St. Paul's got a really unusual history, a tragic history, actually.
We only have about a minute left. So what are you working on now, Jacqueline?
Well, talking about the decline of species, I mean, the Yukon River has shut down commercial and subsistence fisheries because the chum salmon just aren't there. And fish processors out in Bristol Bay, which had a bumper return of salmon, have donated 25,000 pounds of fish. Otherwise, there's going to be hunger on the Yukon River. People are very dependent on the salmon to make up, a huge part of their diet, especially, and they put the food up and preserve it and, share it and eat salmon all winter until the following spring. So it's going to take a donation now to keep people from going hungry.
And we look forward to that story, Jacqueline. That'll run tomorrow, I believe.
Yeah.
Joaqlin Estus, our national correspondent. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. Thank you for watching. For all the latest news, go to IndianCountryToday.com. I'm Mark Trahant.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run. This is Indian Country Today.